Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinars. For those of you who are, there's a lot of familiar faces on today, I think, but for those of you who may be new to connecting with PROWebinar, we offer free monthly webinars every month, and we just choose a different topic, and we try and use any client things that have happened with clients or some questions that are coming out of them to try and generate some of our webinar topics. So we are always open to some suggestions. If you have a topic you'd like to see us cover, please don't hesitate to shoot us an email. We are more than happy to customize one of the upcoming events to meet your needs. So without further ado, we're going to start talking about driving ergonomics. So that's the focus of today's session, and we've been getting a lot of requests actually about driving ergonomics. It's been a popular topic just lately, and in particular, I think what we're I think what we're getting a lot of that for is folks who have a sales team or have a maybe a municipality or a large environment like that where there are a lot of folks who drive as part of their everyday roles and trying to figure out how to protect them as best as possible, right? We're pretty good at dealing with folks in the office, not bad at dealing with folks who have sort of in a shop or in a facilities kind of jobs. But then you get these folks who maybe even drive their own vehicles and get a stipend of some kind. And how do we help them be more safe when they are at work as well? And so this driving ergonomics has been a popular topic of conversation. We're getting a lot of requests for wellness day activities actually associated with driving ergonomics, which kind of makes sense, right? It's a good fit for a wellness day, we think, because it really speaks to everybody. Unless you take public transit and sit on the subway for, getting to and from work, driving ergonomics applies to you. So the vast majority of your employees probably drive to work, right? I mean, again, depending on your location, but the vast majority drive for work. So even if they don't drive or drive to work, even if they don't drive while they're at work, right? They come and they sit in a desk, this still applies, which is I think where the attraction has come from a wellness perspective, is that it does speak to almost every employee that you have, either personally or professionally, which is kind of a nice fit. So why is driving harmful? Let's just start with a quick summary of that piece. I think we all know that driving is hard on our body. If you've ever been on any kind of road trip, you get out at the end of the day and you are stiff, right, or sore. You feel like you need to do a bit of stretching, right? Driving is hard on our body, and we know that. So we want to make sure that we are identifying what those hazards are, and then hopefully addressing them through proper setup and use of our adjustment features, which is kind of a nice option. So driving is harmful because the ligaments in your back that help to hold your spine together and upright in the position it's meant to be in, they stretch when they're seated. So ultimately, even just being in the seated position for a long period of time will create that tension. So when you stand again, it's not like it happens instantaneously where those ligaments snap back into position, right? That they need time to slowly come back to fully support the spine. It takes several minutes, if not longer, for them to actually recover from being seated for a prolonged period of time. So on top of that, not only are you seated, but now we start to create pressure points. Perhaps if the seat is poorly adjusted, it doesn't fit you properly. And sometimes it's literally that the seat doesn't fit you properly, that you're particularly tall or you're like me and quite a bit shorter, and you're having more difficulty finding the right fit in your vehicle. Obviously, if we're going to be sitting, we have to hold our head and our neck upright in position, and that can lead to muscle strain. And then we also have some elements of holding a foot pedal down. In particular, if you drive a standard vehicle of some kind or has a second foot pedal and perhaps even a lever to adjust or to a gear shift to adjust the gears, all of a sudden you may be adding some additional stiffness and discomfort just based on the features that are present in order to drive successfully. So that said, in the United Kingdom, they've taken driving ergonomics fairly seriously, and we've even seen the term repetitive driving injury, like we've seen repetitive strain injury here for office folks or for folks in sort of in a more structured environment. They coined this term the repetitive driving injury, or RDI, and it refers to driving-related injuries like back pain, stiff neck, shoulder pain. Oh, excuse me, my slides are flipping on their own today. Right, shoulder pain, as well as foot cramps caused by using the pedals of the vehicle. And these are the most common types of injuries we see as part of a driving-related issue at the workplace, right? Is that people who drive most frequently report low back pain, but there also is neck, shoulder pain, as well as foot cramps, or maybe even knee pain, depending on their setup, just to depress those pedals in the lower limb. So the major risk factors in the vehicle is that when you're driving, you have constant low-frequency whole-body vibration, right? So not only, if you think back to a couple slides ago, not only are you sitting for long periods of time, and that you are that's not an ideal posture, right? That it changes the loading of our spine. We have to support our head and neck on top of that, right? The posture we're in may not actually make that any easier for us. Now we take that sort of awkward positioning that we're in, and we spend the whole time basically being vibrated around, which is going to aggravate all of those pre-existing issues that we just mentioned, right? It's going to aggravate all of those things because vibration just makes things worse, essentially. And I actually have a whole slide here in a second on vibration, so I'm going to come back to that one in more detail in a moment. Exposure time is another major factor. Some people it depends on your role, right? Some people, if you're a delivery driver and you have a relatively small sort of geographical area, you may be in and out quite regularly, right? You may drive for 10 or 15 minutes, hop out. You may drive for 10 or 15 minutes and hop out and unload your vehicle. Then you get back in the car, you drive another 10 or 15 minutes, you hop out, you do your unloading, right? That it's relatively short exposure. But then you have some folks, like perhaps thinking about some, like a police officer or a salesperson who may have is in a more rural area and has quite a distance to travel to get to see clients. They may spend several hours in a vehicle, if not an entire day, when you start to think about your truck drivers and folks like that who are going to spend very significant amounts of time in their vehicle. The exposure time is huge, right? So not only are you in a strange posture, you're in it for hours and hours on end, and you add a vibration element that's constant, right? So all of those three things combine to create some unique issues. Obviously, posture is a factor, which I've already highlighted, and that's really what we're going to focus on today, is that I can't necessarily eliminate the exposure time, right? If you have to drive and have to get to certain places, I may not be able to change that. But what I can control is the fact that the posture you're in while you are doing it is as best as possible, right? I also can't change the vibration. The car vibrates. That's the way it works, right? Terrain plays a role here, so bumpy terrain or other things that are uneven may increase your risk of injury, right? And then stress or tension that we carry is going to also add our risk of injury because we tighten up when we're stressed, right? We get tighter and more, our muscles are more tense and they're not very pliable. And so as a result, the constant vibration, awkward posture, and stress elements come together to create a greater increased risk of injury. And I've got a statistic down there on the right that says your risk of back injury is increased 2 to 4 times if you routinely drive greater than 30 kilometers in a day. And I bet almost all of us drive greater than 30 kilometers in a day just to get to work, right? Back and forth from home to work. I bet you drive more than 30 kilometers. And if you have staff that drive regularly, I almost guarantee they drive more than 30 kilometers in a day, right? So that's pretty significant. So in terms of vibration element, I wanted to highlight this a little bit more specifically. The vehicle vibration occurs in the vertical plane, right? So as your vehicle is driving, right, it's bouncing you up and down, essentially. That's the vertical plane. So that's the same direction that your spine is traveling in. So even low frequency vibration causes those muscles to get more fatigued because they're doing a lot of work to hold you in this position and they're constantly being bounced around. And so they will contract and relax and adjust all the time, trying to hold you in the position that you're asking them to do so. And as a result, we get fatigue. So your back muscles fatigue, your neck muscles fatigue, and then your spine isn't as supported as usual because those muscles are tired. They're not able to hold that tight contraction anymore. And so they slowly start to, it starts to be more uncomfortable to drive, right? And then I mentioned already bumpy terrain, misalignment in your vehicle, right? A vehicle that vibrates or shakes on its own in addition to just the road shaking or road vibration also creates some challenges. And then poor shocks, worn down seating, etc., can increase your vibration exposure. The next thing I want to highlight there was posture, right? And so vibration is an element, but driving is also hard on your back because of the postural element. So you can see in my picture at the top of the screen there, the picture on the left obviously has a relatively straight spine. You can still see that they still have that sort of S-curve shape in their spine, and the person on the right has totally curved out, right? They've lost that S-shaped curve, so the spinal curve is no longer in the correct, the spinal curve no longer really even exists, and it certainly isn't in the right position, and that new position now creates a lot of increased muscle fatigue. So your vibration weakens your back muscles, your ligaments, your discs. Pressure points can be created, especially when you end up in an awkward back position. You now create an extra tension point, which is a real challenge. So stress that we have sometimes associated with driving, right? Like you've all driven in a particularly busy, hectic, you're late for something, right? And you're sitting in traffic that's bumper to bumper, not going anywhere, right? The stress associated with, oh, pardon me, I think my slides are going to flip on their own all day, so I'm going to have to keep going backwards. I apologize for that. So stress that's sometimes associated with driving worsens that posture and it increases that muscle tension. So if you are additionally tense on top of the vibration and other things going on, if you're additionally tense because you are in a very difficult driving environment, then that's going to make or compound all of these other issues. And I've got a note up there that in the seated position, the discs of your back are less capable of handling vibration from a vehicle, right? So sitting alone adjusts the spinal alignment a little bit. And so when we're sitting, that makes it more difficult for our back to be capable of handling that vibration, because now it's in an awkward posture just because I'm seated, and then I'm adding all the vibration other elements to it. So in terms of the posture, what we're looking for when you sit down in a vehicle, it's most important, just like it is in an office chair. There's actually a lot of similarities to this and an office chair. One of the most important features is that you actually sit into the chair, right? So that you push your butt right to the back of the seat so that you can use the backrest as best as possible, right? If it's properly adjusted to fit you, if it can be, right, then putting your butt right to the back of that seat and then leaning on the backrest will give you the support that you need in the vehicle. Ideally, we always sit equally on both buttocks. In particular, never sit on your wallet. Remove objects from pants pockets like your phone or keys or other things that may be in there, because that creates an imbalance as well as potentially a pressure point, especially when you think about sitting on your wallet, for example, or a phone or keys getting stuck in your pocket. We now have a lot of cars that you don't even have to put your key into, right? So it's way more common to leave your key in your pocket or in your coat pocket, and that can create an awkward pressure point depending on where your seatbelt hits you, or perhaps even with the edge of the seat pan. So you want to make sure that all the stuff is out of your pockets. Other good tips to remember is to keep your shoulders down and your arms relaxed, right? And we'll talk about what hand position is sort of ideal in terms of setup here in a moment. But relaxing those shoulders and arms down is ideal, and then stretching the top of your head upwards to the sky, right? That we want the crown of our head pointing right at the ceiling or right up at the sky, so that we can be sure that our head is stacked right on top of our spine. That gives us the best positioning for our head and neck. If you, as a lot of folks do, they crane forwards a little bit, so their chin will stick out. That's partly a product of your lower back being misaligned, but in doing so, now your head is pulling forwards, right? So it's even further stretching all those neck muscles at the back that are meant to hold your neck in place, right? So we want to make sure that we stack it right on top and be thoughtful of that posture. And then we keep our chin slightly down, and obviously your eyes scanning far ahead down the road so you can see anything that's upcoming. So no matter what we do here, good posture is important, but sitting is still going to be difficult on your body. So one of the important things that we try and remind everyone is that you want to get out of your vehicle regularly. Even if you are doing a long haul of some kind, right, it's still important to schedule regular breaks. It doesn't have to be a 20-minute break or a half an hour break, right? Literally a 5-minute pit stop to grab a cup of water, go to the bathroom, right? Just stand and stretch for a moment, right? Getting up out of the vehicle approximately every hour to 2 is ideal. And I mean, this makes great sense if you've been following all the literature about how sitting is the new smoking and sitting is killing us, and they've been talking about it in the office environment, right? Think about how much worse it is when you spend 3, 4, 5, 6 hours in a car environment. You're still sitting. Your posture is probably not quite as good because a chair seat generally, a vehicle seat has less adjustments than a chair seat, and you add the vibrational element, right? So you're adding some additional risk factors here. So if you think sitting for hours on end in your office chair is terrible, start to think about how that is different and potentially even worse in your vehicle, right? So those breaks become incredibly important, that we actually get up and stand as often as possible. So I want to spend the bulk of our time today sort of talking about how to properly adjust the driver's seat and some of the controls that you have present in your vehicle. The first one there is seat height. Ideally, when we're looking at a vehicle seat, you're going to raise your seat as high as you can to still be comfortable. Obviously, you want to have some clearance so that you can get your head in underneath the vehicle. Never a problem in my world. I'm only 5'2", right? But you want to be able to get your head tucked in there. That's to be comfortable, and you need to be able to obviously see out your windshield. Raise your seat as high as possible. This is particularly relevant for vehicles that are short. So your SUVs, your vans, other vehicles that are higher, typically, it's not as important to have your seat super high, but when you're in something that's small, typically what ends up happening is that your knees are often above your hip height, which is really not an ideal positioning for your lower back, as it often creates a more forward tilt of our sort of pelvic area. So we want to make sure that we actually raise our seat height up as high as we can to try and minimize that angle and get those knees as close to being in line with the hips as we can. If you have an option, seat cushion depth is a nice feature to be able to create 2 or 3 fingers of space between the edge of the seat and the back of the legs. It's just annoying to have something rub against the back of your legs all day. Sometimes there's even levers on the front of the seat, like your seat slider, for example, that may create some contact stress there, so you want to avoid that whenever possible. Your seat often can be adjusted forwards and backwards. I mean, in fact, I think in every car it can, right? You need to be able to slide your seat forwards and backwards. So you want to position your seat so you can fully reach the pedals, and you should be able to use your entire foot, not just your toes, right? So you don't want to be reaching, think about a case of emergency, right? Day to day, probably using your toes isn't such a big deal, right? Be using the top half of your foot or the top portion of your foot. But in a case of emergency, you need to be able to slam on the brake or slam on the gas, whichever is more relevant in the situation, right? So you want to be able to actually do that using your whole foot, not just a piece of your foot. Think about what it would feel like in case of emergency to reach out tippy-toed trying to slam the gas to the floor, right? That's not the ideal positioning. So we want to make sure that our whole foot can be used. Your heel can sit on the floor, right? So when you're using your whole foot on the pedal, your heel can also sit on the floor in that position. Knees slightly bent to create that nice soft knee, and again, that creates the ability to fully depress the pedal in case of emergency. And if we can, we're looking at a hip angle that is 90 to 100 degrees, right? So that's going to get those knees and those hips aligned in straight positioning. In terms of our seat cushion angle, a lot of vehicles do come with this as an option. It's not in every vehicle, but it is quite common nowadays. So if you can, you want to create an incline where the seat is slightly higher at the back than at the front, which is probably opposite to what most people I see do when I'm doing a vehicle assessment. They often have the front edge higher than the back. And sometimes that's because somebody's quite tall and they need the head space, and obviously the back of the seat is where your spine sits and where your head sits on top. So sometimes it's lower because of that, but generally speaking, it's just something that people do on their own. They fold into a seat, into a vehicle seat, and the ideal is definitely to get those knees and hips aligned. So if you can jack up the back of your chair, which is quite common, then ideally you can create that more neutral position, which is really the way we're aiming. In terms of backrest angle, the rule here is exactly the same as what applies to an office chair, right? Your backrest angle, we used to tell everybody you want to sit up 90 degrees, perfectly straight. Nobody really sits like that, and in particular in a vehicle, the vibrational element in a 90-degree position is really hard on your back. So we want to make sure that we're just slightly off square. It's going to change the way the vibration hits us, right, and actually encourage you to lean back and use the backrest of the chair. I always tell people when I'm doing an office assessment or a vehicle assessment that the backrest of a chair is really, or of a seat, is really properly named. It's meant to give your back a break or back a rest. So in doing so, it actually is supporting your spine, right? That's how it gives you that break. So if you are perfectly upright or even leaning forwards, which is worse, to be honest, then ultimately what you're doing is taking away the advantage of the support the backrest provides. Right? It will take some of the load off the spine. It will provide you with some additional support to help those fatiguing muscles. So we want to be slightly reclined in order to fully support our back while we're sitting. And some vehicles have the lovely feature of a lumbar support, and you would think this option would come with the more expensive vehicles, but that isn't necessarily my experience with vehicles. I've seen folks who are driving things, now this is dating me a little bit, but driving things like a Sunfire, for example, right? So a little small, relatively inexpensive car, and it would have a lumbar support that came standard. But your high-end vehicles don't necessarily have that as a feature. So it is very hit or miss which vehicle has this. It's kind of a crapshoot a little bit. So it's something you may want to watch for, especially when you're thinking about maybe purchasing some fleet vehicles. This is a really lovely option if you can get it. So if you have that option, adjust it up and down, and it often does one of these or not the other, right? So you may be able to adjust it up and down to properly fit your curve. It might also be able to adjust in and out. So while you're sitting up tall, you want that lumbar support to fit the curve of your lower back. So when you sit tall, it should just sit into that natural curve of your lower back. I like to describe that curve as where all your movement happens. If you were to sit up tall right now and then hunch forwards, right, intentionally losing good back posture, the part of your back that flattens out when you sit down and when you lean forwards is the part of the backrest that we want that lumbar support to fill, right? Because that means that when I lean on the backrest, my lumbar support will curve around the cushioning that is there. Some seats even allow you to adjust it in and out, so to increase the depth, which is a really lovely feature because then it allows you to adjust the depth to fit your individual curve as well. So if you have that as an option, that's a great feature to throw in there too. So far that's mostly seat adjustment options. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other controls and equipment in the vehicle that are designed for safety purposes as well as from an ergonomic perspective. So let's talk briefly about the steering wheel and the head restraint. So we're looking at the steering wheel. You want to tilt your steering wheel so the airbag is pointed right at your chest, not at your head or your neck. So this is something to be thoughtful of. It can also be a significant when you're adjusting the seat height, for example. This is another factor that you may consider. For example, myself, being only 5'2", when I sit in a vehicle, if I sit too low, not only do I have more difficult time seeing, but I can't get the airbag adjusted properly. So I want that to be pointed directly at my chest. Obviously, if the airbag deploys, I want it to stop my body, right? My body's momentum. And so that means it needs to hit me in the chest. If it hits me in the face, and you do see this, like you'll see people who come out of an accident and their face is black and blue. And what they've done is taken the airbag in the face, right? The airbag deployed. It deploys with a huge amount of force. And the impact point then becomes your face or your neck or a portion of your sort of upper body and including your face. And that's not really how your momentum is properly stopped in a vehicle in case of emergency, right? So we want it to point directly at your chest, right? So it hits you right sort of in that chest bone. And you want to adjust the distance of the steering wheel if you can to be approximately 12 inches away. Now this is a Canadian standard. 12 inches is the recommendation for Canadians. I believe the numbers are different for the U.S. So I'm not sure if we have any U.S. folks on with us today, but you will want to look that reference up for the U.S. as well if you're coming from that area, or perhaps even have sites there. The reference here might be different for those sites. Okay. So the idea here behind is it matters. Why, you might ask me the question, why does it matter how far away my steering wheel is? And the reality is a couple things. Number one, the airbag has room to deploy, which is important. And number two, we want to make sure that we can reach the steering wheel with our elbows slightly bent. So when you reach out to the steering wheel, 12 inches from the front of your body is probably going to allow you to create a slight bend with your elbows, which is really the ideal. Again, in an accident, in the right position, your elbows, your hands should sort of fly away from you, your airbag should deploy, and you should be able to maintain that good posture, right? Or not good posture, but you should be safe and everything moves away from you and you can reach that steering wheel when you are driving. The head restraint is another important safety feature in the vehicle, and one that incredibly few people actually adjust when they get into the car. This is very true if you have vehicles that are used by multiple individuals. So you may have fleet vehicles, right? A fleet of vehicles, you go down, you sign one out for whatever event or meeting you have to go to, and you just get into the car and you make the adjustments you need, right? It feels awkward, you can't reach the pedals, you adjust the seat length, etc. But a lot of folks don't take a moment to adjust the headrest. And again, an important safety feature of your vehicle is that you can see my diagram there. You want to align the top of the headrest with the top of your head and avoid a big gap between your head and the headrest. Again, in case of emergency, I want the headrest to stop that momentum. I don't want an opportunity for my head to snap backwards, right? I'm more likely to experience whiplash and other injuries that are neck related if my headrest isn't properly adjusted. You can see in picture number 3 there as well, the headrest also needs to be in line with the top of the head. If it's too low right behind the neck, your head has a lot of range of movement before it actually is going to get stopped, right? So ideally, we're looking for 1 inch or 2 from the back of your head to the headrest. Right, so for some females, I know wearing a ponytail or something in your hair sometimes limits how close you can get to the headrest, but it is important to think about taking those sorts of things out while you're driving and putting them back in, like a clip or a ponytail certainly is removable and could go back in later that would allow you to get to the proper distance from your headrest. So those are most of the adjustment features in a vehicle. If you have one that you have seen and you have in your current vehicle or have seen in one of your fleet vehicles that you wanted to ask a question about that I didn't address, please feel free to use the question bar to do that, and I'll revisit those here shortly. But before we go, I want to talk also about entering and exiting the vehicle and the importance of different options for doing it, number 1, and the importance of doing it safely, again, so that we are protecting ourselves from a postural perspective and an ergonomic perspective all the way in and all the way out. So there's really 2 ways to get in and out of a vehicle. Typically, you get in and out forwards or backwards, really are the 2 options, and likely the one you choose is based on how big of a vehicle you have. And you'll see folks who drive heavy equipment, for example, are always going to enter and exit backwards, and people who drive a vehicle are much more frequently going to enter and exit forwards. So ideally, when we're talking about forwards positioning, we're going to start, if we're exiting the vehicle, by swinging our legs out, right, and actually turning ourselves so that we're more sideways with the seat. You want to slide forward so your feet are fully on the ground. And again, for taller individuals, this may not be a problem. For myself, I pretty much always have to scooch forward before my feet will fully touch the ground. Right, so we want to swing our legs out, sit sideways, and get our feet on the ground, and then use the vehicle to actually support our body, right? Rather than hauling ourselves out of the seat, we want to use the vehicle to help us in that process. So you can use the frame of the seat there. You can use the door, perhaps. There's different anchor points that can be helpful for you, but you want to use that vehicle to support your body while you get out, which is a nice option and can make it a lot safer. And then obviously we're going to bend at the hips, the knees, and keep our back straight in the standing process or in the sitting process if you're doing it in reverse, right? You want to maintain that good back posture, be thoughtful about your posture, right? It's not just getting out of the vehicle and getting in is actually quite a physical process because you have to lift your entire body weight out of the vehicle or slow the momentum down as you're climbing in, right? So you want to bend at your hips, knees, keep your back straight, try and maintain that good back posture the entire way you climb out of the vehicle. If you can, and you should be able to, maintain 3 points of contact. So that's 2 feet in a hand or 2 hands in a feet, and a foot, to maintain that 3 points of contact at all times. But that allows you to get out in the most safe way possible. And obviously, the reverse of this is true if you're getting into the vehicle, not getting out. If you have folks who use bigger equipment, so I think about my municipality clients, snow plows, heavy equipment like backhoes, etc., you're pretty much always going to use enter and exit backwards is how we describe this. So it's when you look at the picture I've got there, he's maintaining 3 points of contact, right, 2 hands and a foot, and he's using the runner or the steps to allow him to grab the, or in this case he's going out of the vehicle, but using the runner or the steps first and then going to the ground. And if you're getting into the vehicle, coming from the ground to the step, not just hauling yourself up. In his picture, you probably can't do that, but sometimes people skip a step or try and hop straight into the vehicle and avoid the actual climb in and out, avoid that sort of in-between step. But especially in heavy equipment and big equipment, those steps are often quite high, probably higher than true ergonomic standards would suggest, only because there's a lot of stuff in the way and they often can't be designed the way you might like them to be. But you want to be thoughtful about using them as much as possible because that is going to be your safest way. Use the grab bar if there is one, right? Not the steering wheel. That's a common mistake is that people reach up for the steering wheel, but the problem with that is the steering wheel moves potentially, right? So you think you have a stable hold and all of a sudden you don't. And so you want to avoid using the steering wheel if you can. And obviously, same as the other one, keeping that back straight, using your hips and your knees to haul yourself up, using your actual upper body to pull, right? So it's not just your lower body that's doing the step, right? And if you're going out of the vehicle, we want to make sure that both hands stay on the vehicle until you're securely on the ground. So you may, it depends on what type of vehicle you have, but climbing out of the vehicle backwards is, I said, by far most common in sort of bigger equipment type vehicles. Other important things to remember when you're looking at your vehicle options is the loading and unloading component. A significant number of employees who use your vehicles likely have to load or unload portions of it. And so I want to make sure that we talk briefly about this just to be thoughtful. And this is a good education talking point if you're doing some education with the staff members about how you do this safely. So in terms of lifting guidelines, I think these are pretty straightforward, right? I'm talking about general lifting, is you always want to practice safe lifting. You want to never reach for objects in the passenger seat or the back seat, right? Everything you want to be, you want to walk around the vehicle to access those objects, right? So enter the door that is closest to the thing that you're trying to lift, right? And use, if you're using a vehicle and not necessarily a van or a truck, if you have a storage net, that's an ideal option as well, especially if you have just a few things to hold in your trunk, because often when you're driving, things shift around and they end up at the back of the trunk or in an awkward to reach spot, and a vehicle net can keep things at the front so that it's going to reduce the amount of reaching you have to do or bending to get into the vehicle. And if you have a vehicle that's like a van or a truck bed where you're going to actually have to pull things out of, ideally would be important that you actually get into the truck bed or the van back and actually move those objects that you need to the front rather than trying to reach and pull from the ground, right? So if you need to, try and get in there and move stuff around. It's just a good work methods and good practices to implement in your sort of day-to-day practices. A common way that we can retrieve things from a vehicle, or there's two common ways. One is one knee on or in the vehicle, and the second is to use both feet on the ground. And both are relevant depending on where an object is stored in your trunk. So for example, the one knee on or in the vehicle I have pictured here is where you would place one knee on the bumper or a seat, if you're talking about your back seat perhaps, that's close to knee height, right? If it's a really tall vehicle, then this isn't a very appropriate selection. But if you can do that, then you can bend keep your back straight and bend your hips and your knees. But this positioning allows you to keep a more straight back position. And then the object that you're reaching for that's far away, you slide that towards you, then you lift it out, right? It sort of works in stages there. And you want to lift your head. You want to look straight ahead. The goal here is, again, to keep your neck and head stacked right on top of that spine. And then when you do get the object forwards, you're going to lift using safe lifting guidelines like we've already talked about. In terms of both feet on the ground, this is another option, and it's typically better if your trunk is full, number one, you can't really get in there easily, or if your objects are relatively close to the front of the trunk already, you're going to get as close as possible to the vehicle. So you see in my picture, this gentleman actually has his knees bumping against the trunk, and that would be really the ideal, is that we get really close to the vehicle because that's going to reduce our bending and our reach distances. You want to stand with your feet shoulder width apart, right? Again, good strong posture. Bend your knees and hips, again, maintaining that straight back. And if I like to use a tip, somebody along the way gave me a visual tip as a reminder for safe lifting, which has always stuck with me because it's a great visual, is that you actually need to stick your bum out. So when you're going to do a lift, any kind of lift, the ideal posture to achieve good back positioning is actually to stick your butt out. If you stick your bum out, that will create that natural curve in your back that you're looking for. So you want to stick your bum out a little bit and then lean forwards with the hips, and that will allow you to maintain that nice neutral posture. Right, and then again, if the object is a little bit further from the edge of the trunk, you bring that closer to you before you actually do a lift. One of the things that I want to highlight here is sort of on both sides of the coin, right? From an employer perspective, and many of you are here today from an employer perspective, you may want to think about doing some different things with these staff members, right? That you probably have done some work with your office staff traditionally, but it's been harder to figure out how you're going to address the needs of your drivers. And so you may want to take some time to do some good education with them, give them the tips and the strategies that they need in order to be successful in adjusting their vehicle properly, and as well as actually lifting, like the things we just talked about, how to lift things out of your vehicle. And one thing I didn't even talk about is how to, it's coming up here in a moment, right? How you need to wait a few minutes after you actually stop before you do some lifting. That's a particularly challenging time for our back when it's readjusting to the new standing position, right? So you may want to take some time to do some safe driving techniques training with your staff members, and it can be really hands-on. We've done some really exciting ones just lately with a couple clients in particular who wanted, we did some with heavy equipment operators, so we actually had them in their equipment. And those vehicles adjust a lot sometimes, and it's just an important element that people remember that and that they know how to adjust them so that they actually fit them properly. So we've spent some time doing that. We've spent some time in wellness events, like I mentioned, where we'll actually roll in a couple fleet vehicles right into like a truck bay or out front of the training facility or whatnot, and have small groups come out and actually get in the vehicle, and we adjust it for each person, showing them what it really is from an ergonomic perspective, what we're looking for when you're sitting. So it's not just a theory-based element, but we actually get people in the vehicles trying. So it can be a really fun training for people as well. And again, I mentioned it applies to everybody as long if you drive at all, right? So it's a really neat training option. Other things that you could be doing as an employer is to ensure regular vehicle maintenance to reduce vibration. So you want to make sure your shocks are in good condition, that your seats are not falling apart. You do see that sometimes in heavy equipment or stuff that's used, less so in fleet vehicles, more so in sort of heavy equipment that's used very regularly with lots of wear and tear. You want to make sure that that's repaired or replaced as needed, that all the vehicle features, like all the adjustment features, actually work, because sometimes you go in and you know that the vehicle seat should slide, for example, forwards and backwards, but it's stuck, and so that would require some maintenance to repair. Tire pressure, alignments, etc. All your sort of general maintenance things should be up to date. Ideally, we also can get involved from a design perspective, right? So all of that's retroactive. Train your staff to use it well, do regular maintenance on your vehicles, but if you can get involved in the design phase, right, really it's not design, it's more purchasing phase, right, so that you're actually purchasing equipment that has the adjustment features that you want. So for example, if lumbar support in a vehicle seat is important to you, then that should be a standard that you're looking for when you are shopping for vehicles to add to your fleet. So those kinds of things, if you set sort of adjustment features that you want your purchasing team to be looking for, that these are mandatory from an ergonomic perspective, then you may start getting vehicles that can be fully adjusted and really support your staff that are going to be spending a lot of time in them. So I would suggest that you take a look at that. If you don't have any kind of standard or purchasing standard, it might be something you want to consider adding or working on achieving, right? Looking at what adjustment features are essential and how do we communicate that. The other part of this is your employee, right? So if you are the employee or if you want to communicate to your employee, we want to switch or sit with proper posture and change postures frequently. So you want to shift around in your seat a little bit. It doesn't mean I don't want you to go from laying down to sitting up 90 degrees and all over the place, but using those chair adjustment features to create some minor movement throughout your day can be a nice way to help break up some of the static elements of driving. Use safe entering and exiting practices, which is ideal. And it is important that we wait a little bit of time after getting out of the vehicle before doing manual labor tasks. And this one actually came up not super recently, I guess, but we were working with a group that of garbage collectors, and so they had a two-person truck, so somebody in the vehicle driving and somebody at the back climbing on and off to load it, and they wanted to implement our rotational element, right? So they wanted to rotate who was on the back and who was in the cab quite regularly to minimize the amount of lifting the person on the back was doing. And in theory, this sounds great, right? Job rotation has some potential really significant benefits, etc. But what they quickly discovered is that when you do actually review literature and look at the research, it was way more likely that they would actually increase their number of injuries because they would be in order to maintain speed and efficiency, they're going to quickly change, position to position. As the person stops, they're going to climb out of the cab. They're going to come around to the back. As the person loads it in, then they're going to reverse positions and they're going to move on to the next house, right? To be efficient with their garbage collection process. Well, that creates a new challenge because the person who's been sitting in the vehicle for the last hour, let's say, is now getting out, and that within moments they will be doing their first lifts, sometimes up to 50 pounds, very significant weights, and we really do want to give them at least 2 to 3 minutes, if not 4 to 5 minutes, to get your spine realigned and get those muscles coming back into position before we start doing any lifting. Right, so you want to make sure that your staff is aware they need to take a short break. It doesn't mean that 20 minutes, but 2 or 3 minutes at minimum, just to get their spine muscles sort of coming back into position before they start doing any lifting tasks. I already mentioned breaks. Certainly stretching for any lower back discomfort that you have would be ideal. It's a thank you. So that's all the content I want to cover today in terms of layout or setup. I'm happy to field some questions if you want to shoot me an email here, or excuse me, a question in the question box there. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. But I did want to have a free giveaway today for those of you who came on and joined us. I really appreciate you joining us for our webinars, and we do try and provide some tips and strategies that you will find useful for your workplace. In particular, today we have a great driving ergonomics handout that we're working on for one of our other clients, and we've been using quite regularly. So I'm going to send that out to all of you, and you can use it as a poster or a handout. You could share it with your sales team, whoever you think is going to be most benefited by it. But I'm going to send that out to all of you so you can have it on file as a nice tip sheet that you can reference and use in the future. So hopefully you find that helpful. If you are looking for any driving ergonomics training or work with your staff, you have a wellness day coming up, you think this might really be a good topic, please let me know, and I'm happy to get you some pricing on that and talk to you about how we can make it engaging and interactive, because it really can be a fun training to do. So if you do have any questions, I'm ready for them right now. Somebody's asking if the slides in the presentation are available for download. They're not available for download. What we do now is I've recorded this webinar, and I will be posting it on our YouTube channel. And when I send out the free tip sheet, I will include the link to the YouTube video. So you can revisit it and watch it as often as you might like. In the future, you could share it with someone if you wanted someone else to see it. I have a question coming in that says, in some of our fleet vehicles, the back bulkhead limits the amount of the distance of how far back this driver's seat can be moved back. This doesn't accommodate for leg length of taller employees. We recommended additional stretches throughout the day. Any suggestions on how to best address that without changing the vehicle? Good question. I would say this is a common issue with some of the large vehicles, is that there has to be a lot of things in the cab, and so sometimes that limits the range of motion that people have, for example. So yes, I think your strategy of additional stretches are great. I would set out exactly which stretches I would suggest that they would do, so that you're not just giving people what I'm described as sort of a random suggestion to stretch, because they won't do it, right? But they're more likely to receive it if you give them some direction. We want you to do these 3 stretches every hour, for example, right? Give them some guidance and direction on what they should be doing in that time, and make sure that they actually have the time to do it. Sometimes we tell people to do things like stretching or taking breaks or whatnot, but we don't, I'm going to say management team doesn't always create that as an option for them to do. Like, the way their work is scheduled, they really don't have those 2 or 3 minutes or those 5 minutes that they need to be able to do it. So just be mindful of that when you suggest that as an option. Suggestions on how to best address it. I'm not sure. Good question. Any specific stretches I would recommend? I mean, there's certainly any lower body stretches in particular. If they're limited in leg length, they're going to have some awkward neck positions, and they're going to have knees above their hips. So some good hip stretches to create more hip mobility, as well as some lower back stretches are probably ideal. You may also find that you want some lower limb stretches. So for example, your hamstrings may get tight, or your quads may get tight in that slightly folded up position. So you might consider those as well. So those are sort of the areas I would focus, is sort of hip mobility, maybe a lower back stretch, and then something for your lower limbs, probably more for your upper leg than for your lower leg. Hopefully that helps you. Any suggestions on how to best address that without changing the vehicle? I think probably you're doing it the best way you can with stretching strategies, and being thoughtful about who gets assigned to what vehicle as well. Like, there may be options for smaller individuals to be more frequently assigned to, the other way around, larger individuals to be more frequently assigned to vehicles that are larger, and that might be an appropriate strategy as well. At least have them more frequently in vehicles that fit them better. Question here is it recommended to have a heated vehicle seat? Good question. I'm going to say that it's not, by no means is it an ergonomic requirement. There is no real muscular advantage to that, except very short term at the beginning of a drive when the vehicle is still cold, right? So the vehicle seat will keep the lower body warmer when the vehicle is quite cold. But once your vehicle gets warmed up to sort of to ambient temperature, there's really no advantage to having a heated seat. It's a nice option, but not mandatory. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so I will stay on here for another minute. If you have a follow-up question, I'm happy to answer. I did provide some references today as well for some of the content that I pulled out. Obviously, how you set up the vehicle, what working heights, etc., can be relevant to. You might want to reference some of those materials yourself. Oh, one question coming in here. Last question, it looks like, probably. It looks like asking a question about where the hands should be positioned on the steering wheel. Traditionally, sort of 10 and 2 has been the recommendation. And certainly the idea of anywhere sort of between 10 and 2 or 9 and 3 is fine, or even 4 and 8. Right, sort of going in that range there on the side. One thing from a safety perspective we want to avoid is hanging our hand on the top, like driving with one-handed, using the top of the hand of the steering wheel to hang our hand. From a safety perspective, if the airbag deploys, you're going to hit yourself in the face with your hand on top of the airbag, which is not ideal. And then from an ergonomic perspective, it is actually better to be slightly lower. So 10 and 2 means that I have to reach further because my hands are higher. So I actually create a more significant shoulder positioning, whereas 9 and 3, or coming even down a little further to 4 and 8, still really strong positioning, but it actually improves our shoulder posture, right? The difference there is quite significant in what my shoulder positioning looks like. So you may want to consider some different hand positioning like that. But somewhere in the middle is definitely the idea. Oh, good question. Can I do a webinar in the future on vehicle laptop ergonomics? We totally can. We've done a couple of webinars on mobile workstations, and so that has included vehicles like tablets as well as computers in the vehicles, and we can definitely revisit that topic. We're just getting ready to set our next 6 months worth of webinars, so I'll make sure I bring that forward to my team, and we'll work on adding that in, no problem. Okay, everyone, it looks like that's just about it for today. I'm not getting any new questions show up. If you do have something you want to reach out to me for, you can always send me an email, and I will happily get back to you. Otherwise, watch your inbox later today for the link to the video from this recorded webinar, as well as the free tip sheet that I'm going to send out as well. So I hope you have a great day and a great weekend coming up soon, one more day, and that I will talk to hopefully many of you, as a lot of you are current clients, in the next coming weeks. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.